About a year ago, I guess now, I did some research on the Daihishin Dharani, which is part of our morning service. And I've kind of been, I don't know, trying to understand like where these texts came from and why we chant them as part of our service and so forth. So in the case of this, oh, I'll give Misaki a second if it's okay. In the case of this particular text, it was kind of harder to find information about it. There isn't really much available in English, it seems, so I had to work with my very rudimentary Japanese and even more rudimentary Chinese skills to try to make sense of where this came from and so forth. So for those of you who might not be familiar with this text, in case you don't regularly wake up at the crack of dawn and come to our service in the morning, this is a text that we added to the service at the start of the pandemic, and other temples have done the same as well. When I was at Ryumonji this past summer, they were also chanting this in relation to the pandemic. So we chant this text. It's got a nice kind of sound. It's sort of fun to do. I first encountered it when I was at Tassajara, and they would do it 9 times, and each time they would speed up a little bit. So by the end, you're going really fast, and it was kind of fun recitation. So if you haven't heard it, it goes Kanzeon namu butsuyo butsu inyo butsu en bupo so en jorakuga jo chonen kanzeon bonen kanzeon nennen jushinki nennen furishin, and then you repeat it. So it's pretty short. But yeah, it's got this kind of fun, rhythmic, intense sound, I think. So we recite it. It's a classical Chinese text. So when we talk about the Daihishin Dharani, usually the explanation that's given for why we don't translate it is because it's a mantra or Dharani, and it's supposed to have kind of special power when it's said in the original language. And in that case, it's a transliteration that strays a bit from what the original language would have sounded like, quite a bit actually. But in this case, this text is in classical Chinese. It's not like a transliteration of Sanskrit. But that being said, it's another text that's supposed to sort of have special powers. So maybe that's why we do it in the original language. But this one is perfectly translatable. So I'll start with a translation from a scholar, Griffith Folk, just to give you sort of a sense of what it means. So his translation is, Avalokiteshvara, paying homage to Buddha, forged a causal connection with Buddha, a karmic affinity with Buddha, a karmic affinity with Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, thus attaining permanence, ease, selfhood, and purity. In the morning, think of Avalokiteshvara. In the evening, think of Avalokiteshvara. Thought after thought arises from mind. Thought after thought is not separate from mind. So that's his translation. There are a couple of little issues, I think, with it. So I thought the reason I wanted the board today was maybe we could just go through line by line. I can try to emulate Hojo-san and write the characters on the board and explain what they mean. So the title, it's going to be hard for me with a marker, but so I'll pick one that doesn't work. There we go. Okay, kind of works. So Enmei. Get to see my terrible handwriting. Jukku. And then Kan. A long one. Okay, so these 2 characters, it seems, were added later when the text was transmitted to Japan. So originally it was just called Jukku Kannongyo. And Enmei, so this is Enmei. So En means like extending, and Mei is life, so life extending. And then this is Jukku is 10 line. Kannon is Avalokiteshvara, and Gyo is Sutra. So I'll just write that down. this gets kind of doubled here. Kannongyo. Okay, so it's called the 10-line Avalokiteshvara Sutra because it's composed of 10 short lines. And the life-extending thing, it seems to have been added by Hakuin, who's a really famous Rinzai Zen master. And I'll read a little bit from what he had to say about this text in a minute. And this, has to do with kind of the supposed like magical properties of this text and what it can do. So that's why that got added. So the text begins Kanzeon. So the same. So this is one of two kind of main translations for the name of Avalokiteshvara, and this often gets contracted, so the middle character gets cut out, and it's just Kannon, like in the title, Kannon. But there's another way of saying this name in Chinese, which is the same kan and then jizai, which is what we have in the Heart Sutra. So they have kind of different meanings, and Hojo-san talks about this in his commentary on the Heart Sutra in Living by Vow. So I'll just read from this book. And basically it has to do with how the Sanskrit Avalokiteshvara is understood. So in the case of Kanjizai, I should write that, sorry. So this is Kanjizai. So in the case of Kanjizai, so the translation of Avalokiteshvara is divided into two parts. So first you have Avalokita and then Ishvara. So Avalokita means to see in both cases. So that's why you have the kan in both translations, because both interpret the Avalokita as to see. So this means to watch or observe in Chinese. And then in the case of Kanjizai, Ishvara is usually translated as freely. So ji, the character, means like self or kind of independent, and zai means to exist. So it's sort of like self-existing or independently existing or autonomous. So, so Hojo-san writes, this is what the Chinese translation Kanjizai means. Here, Ishvara is translated as Lord, so he's quoting from another translation that uses Lord instead of freely. But he says, a lord is a free person who does not belong to anyone. A great being is a blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that's that part. And then in the case of Kanzeon, so Avalokiteshvara is also called Kanzeon Bosatsu. Bosatsu is Bodhisattva. So Kanjizai and Kanzeon have different meanings. Kan means to see or to observe. Jizai is the translation of the Sanskrit word Ishvara, a person who can see freely without obstruction, as I was just saying. This means one who is free from egocentricity and ignorance, one who sees things as they are without distortion by intellect, desire, or expectation. Kanzeon Bosatsu, so the other possibility here, appears in the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. So this, it comes from the Heart Sutra, so we have Kanjizai in that case. And that was translated by Xuanzang, so that's his kind of translation choice for Avalokiteshvara. This comes from the Lotus Sutra, which was translated by Kumarajiva, so a little bit earlier, and this was the choice that he used for it. So it comes from the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the universal gateway of the Bodhisattva, perceiver of the world sounds, which is an English translation of Avalokiteshvara. So in that case, Avalokiteshvara is interpreted again as Avalokita, to see, and Svara, sound. So instead of Ishvara, it's interpreted as Svara. So when you put Sanskrit words together, stuff happens where the connection is made and the sounds change. So it can be difficult, or sometimes there are multiple options for what the reconstruction will look like. Okay, so at any rate, in this case, we're using the Lotus Sutra version of the name, which gives us a little clue as to what this text is related to, because it turns out that it has a lot to do with the Lotus Sutra. Okay, so next we have Namu, Namu Butsu, so Kanzeo Namu Butsu. So this is just a transliteration. So these characters, literally, this means south. And this means not, so it's the same as like the mu and the mu koan. So this is Namu. And then you have Butsu, which is Buddha. Fun little bit of trivia here. So this Namu is a transliteration of the Sanskrit namas. And we all kind of know this word because namaste in Hindi or Sanskrit just means, so namas means to bow, like a bow, as in this kind of bow. And te is to you, so namaste is bow to you. So this is the same thing here. So it's usually translated as like homage to the Buddha. And you see this a lot, this namu. So it's also in the Daihishin Dharani. The first word is namu karatan no torayaya namu oriya. So you get this namu there too. Okay, so next we have Yo Butsu En, In Yo Butsu En. So the, let's see, let me erase. So this line is a little bit harder to parse, I think. So Yo Butsu, and then In, and then the same thing again, Yo Butsu, and then En. Sorry. Okay, so Yo means like with or together with. Butsu is Buddha. U is like to have, in this case probably. And In is a cause. So that's kind of the important word here. And then again, we get the same line, Yo Butsu En. And this is a condition. And this is the same like Yo Butsu from Yui Butsu, Yo Butsu, the Fascicle of Shobogenzo, so only a Buddha together with a Buddha. So what this, I mean, if you just like translate it literally, right, it's like together with a Buddha, have cause, together with a Buddha, have condition, which sounds weird. But it seems that what this means is that both of these characters independently can mean something like an affinity or a connection. So the translation again that Griffith Folk uses is a karmic affinity with Buddha, a karmic affinity, or a causal connection with Buddha, a karmic affinity with Buddha is the way that he translates it. So it seems that, basically it's saying that Avalokiteshvara has this affinity with the Buddha. So there's kind of a special connection, you might say, between the Buddha and Avalokiteshvara. So the next line is also kind of interesting. It has different kind of variants in different texts. So Yo Butsu In, Yo Butsu En, Bupo So En. So the Bu is again Buddha. And then we have Po, which is like Dharma. And then in the Japanese versions of the text, the next character that you get is Sangha. So, often these come together, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So I have here, this is like an official Soto school chant book. And I don't know if you've seen these, they're kind of cool. They have these concertina pages, and you can do this to get merit. But in this, if you look at where it has the Enmei, Jukku, Kannongyo, it uses the character Sangha for the next character. But if you go back to the original instances where this text occurs in Chinese, it is not the character for Sangha, but it is instead the character that means mutual. And then again, we have the same condition character. Okay, so this is Bupo, Soul, and so if you interpret this as Sangha in the case of the Japanese text, it would be like, an affinity with Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, which is the way that Griffith Folk translates it, because he was using a Japanese version of the text. But in the case of the kind of original Chinese text, this, again, sort of together, this mutual mutual condition is again sort of like a good affinity or good connection. So again, Avalokiteshvara has, in this case, Bupo is Buddha Dharma, so the Buddha's teaching. So Avalokiteshvara has this good affinity with the Buddha Dharma. And then the next line is not that interesting. It's just in the morning, think of Kanzeon. In the evening, think of Kanzeon. I'll just put the character that's used for think of. So this is nen. So we have the Japanese phrase nembutsu, which means to chant usually the name of what Buddha am I thinking of? Someone help me out. The Pure Land Buddha. Amitabha. So nembutsu usually refers to saying the name of Amitabha Buddha. Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, like repeating it like that. So this character has the meaning of recite as one of its meanings, but it also has sort of a meaning of to think, and then in Buddhism it's used as a translation for mindfulness. So in this line, so it says, morning nen, so this character, and then kanzeon, so in the morning think of, or maybe recite the name of Avalokiteshvara. In the evening, do the same. And then in the final line, we get a doubling of this character. So it's nen, and then Jushinki, which is, so this one. And then Shing, and Ki is, glad I have my notes with me. So this character is used in modern Japanese usually to mean like to wake up. But in this case, it's sort of like arises. So this this character here means from, so like from the mind arises. So and nen here, when it's repeated, it can have the specialized meaning in Buddhism of meaning sort of moment by moment or thought by thought. And there's a notion in Buddhism of a kshana, which is supposed to be a moment. So like when you snap your fingers, there's supposed to be 60 kshanas in that instance. So, it's a really small unit of time. And this nen is sometimes used as a translation to mean a kshana of a kshana. So like, a very minute period of time. So I think the idea here is, moment by moment, mind is arising, or from mind, should be arising thoughts of Avalokiteshvara, perhaps. And then the final line is the same nen, and then furishin. So furi. Shin again is mind. So fu, ri, shin. So this means not, it's a negation. Ri is to separate or depart from, and mind again, so not separate from mind, or not separating from mind. So moment by moment, do not separate from the mind, or don't let thoughts of Avalokiteshvara separate from the mind. But interestingly, in the original version, the first instance where this text appears, the second line doesn't do the nen thing. Instead, it replaces this nen with nen butsu. So butsu is Buddha. So kind of mindful of Buddha, do not separate from mind, something like that. It doesn't really substantially change the meaning of what the text is trying to do. So that's kind of a basic idea of what this text means. So I'm sorry if that was kind of boring. We'll move on to Hakuin's presentation. So he wrote, in Japan, it seems that we don't really hear much about this text until Hakuin. So Hakuin wrote to a lay practitioner who happened to be a sort of high-placed Lord Nabeshima. And this is what he wrote to this person. When we met the other day, I had meant to encourage you to take up the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo, but our meeting was so brief that I did not have the opportunity. I therefore sent it for your inspection along with this letter. Nice. This work has been associated with wondrous miracles that have taken place in both China and Japan. Because it is so brief, I sincerely hope that you, not to speak of your close retainers and the common people as well, will recite it 200 or 300 times each day. So I calculated that it takes 15 seconds to say it one time. So 200 or 300 times would take over an hour. In some of the other texts, they say you have to say it 1,000 times, which would take approximately 4 hours. The reason lies in the testing. Give this work to those who are seriously ill or who have met with some unexpected disaster, and have them examine it for their consolation. If it is recited with sincerity, awe-inspiring miracles will without fail be accomplished. Its first advantage is that the person who recites it will be completely free from disease and will attain to long life. This applies to anyone at all. So quite big claims for this text. In ancient China, a certain Gao Huang, a man of constant faith, was for some reason or other sentenced to be executed. Around midnight of the night before he was to die, as he was devoutly concentrating all his attentions on Kannon, the august form of the Bodhisattva appeared before his eyes. He was told that if he were able to recite the Kannon Sutra 1,000 times during the night, his life would be spared. Gao Huang then asked, "It is already past midnight. How can I possibly recite it 1,000 times by morning?" So the Kannon Sutra refers to the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is, it's not that long, but it's like 10 pages. So it would take a long time to recite it 1,000 times. So that seems to be what this person is thinking when this person says you have to recite the Kannon Sutra 1,000 times. He's like, I can't do that. But the Bodhisattva told him to recite the sutra nevertheless and gave him personal instruction. So we'll come back to the original text, but what happens in the original text is kind of in lieu of the Kannon chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo is given instead. The next morning, when the executioner lifted his sword to strike off his head, the blade snapped off at the sword guard. Other swords were brought out, but 3 times the same thing happened. Amazed, the executioner inquired into the reasons for this. After he had been told the story in all its details, Gao Huang was pardoned. From that time on, this sutra was known as the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo. Ever since then, people, monks, or so the life-extending Kannon Sutra, although it wasn't actually known as that until it got to Japan. Ever since then, people, monks, or laymen, men or women who recite the sutra in faith have had their illnesses cured or escaped from perilous disasters. In addition, those who recited it have attained long life. You, my lord, should, when walking, standing, sitting, or reclining, recite it 200 or 300 times every day. It's quite a commitment. The reason I say this is that if samurai and monks as well do not avoid disease and disaster and thereby attain to long life, they will find it difficult to bring their respective ways to fruition. So this is Hakuin writing this. So he's writing in, I think this was written in 1754. So relatively recent. And he's sort of roughly contemporary with Menzan, and both of these figures are considered kind of reformers. So Hakuin was kind of a reformer of the Rinzai school, tried to go back to koan practice and so forth. Menzan is our famous reformer who kind of went back to the teachings of Dogen. So that is kind of, how this text was understood at that time. So going back to where it kind of originally appeared. So there are two texts from the early Song dynasty. So it seems that when this dynasty was established, they wanted to, produce all these texts to sort of legitimize themselves. So the first emperor of the Song dynasty commissioned these two big texts. The first one was called the Taiping Guanji, which means the extensive record of the Taiping era. So this particular text was produced in the year 978, but for some reason it was never published until the Ming dynasty, which is hundreds of years later, like the 14th century, something like that, 15th century. But it has a quotation. In the case of this text, it's a collection of 7,000 stories that are collected from 300 different books, many of which have now been lost. So it's an important record for at least little excerpts of stories. And it's found in a section called, you can translate it as rewards or karmic effects of the Avalokiteshvara Sutra. So again, mostly referring to the Lotus Sutra chapter. And the almost verbatim story appears in another compilation that came out just a few years later in 983, so only 5 years after the first one. And in the case of the second text, it was published and kind of widely used. And it's an example of a text called the Leishu, which literally means like category books, and sometimes the word gets translated as encyclopedia because they're kind of similar in a certain way, but sometimes they'll just copy whole books and put them down in this larger text. So in the case of this text, it's 1,000 volumes and contains 4.7 million characters, so a very, very big compilation. And our story takes up, one paragraph. It's a very brief little story. And the text between these two is virtually identical. There are a few little character changes. And in that case, it's in a section called Praise of the Buddha. So what these texts say is that there was a particular general whose name was Wang Xuanmo, and this is supposed to have taken place. I think this is a real historical person, probably. He comes up in other historical records, but this story, we don't have any documentation of it until this, 10th century compilation. But this story is supposed to take place in the year 450, so several centuries before this text was written. And apparently this general tried to invade I think it was the northern, well, I can't remember which dynasty, but there were like competing dynasties in China at the time. And so this general invaded this northern dynasty, which was ruled by this guy, Emperor Taiwu. But he loses really badly and his army gets crushed and he gets imprisoned. And he's sentenced to death. So this is where the story from Hakuin comes from. In these texts, though, it says he dreams that someone told him to recite the Avalokiteshvara Sutra 1,000 times to avoid death. So in Hakuin's version, it's Avalokiteshvara, him or herself, directly saying it. So this is just some random person. And he does ask how it will be possible, again, probably thinking that this is referring to the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, given that he is going to be executed tomorrow morning. And then in response to that question, he tells Wang the Jukku Kannongyo. And it's quoted there in the text and tells him to recite it 1,000 times and he'll avoid death. So in the stories, it's much more boring. It's just like, and he was pardoned, like the stuff about the sword, like breaking off 3 times, which makes the story much better, I think, is not present in the original. So it's a really short little, like, excerpt of a few sentences. Okay, so Kumarajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra dates from the year 406, so it was about 50 years before this event was supposed to have happened. But actually, it seems that There's another text which is called the High King Avalokiteshvara Sutra, or this High King. It's the character for high and then king. So some people interpret it as like a particular king named King Gao, which would be the translation of high there. So it's unclear if it's referring to King Gao's Avalokiteshvara Sutra or the High King Avalokiteshvara and her or his sutra. And this text was apparently produced in the 5th century, meaning after the life of Wang Xuanmo, which would mean the story was made up at some later point. But we don't really know much about this text. It only survives from 2 incomplete manuscripts, one of which was found in Dunhuang Caves, which is the really famous sort of archaeological site in Western China where a lot of important texts have been found. And then another one from also from Xinjiang, so the western dry part of what is now China, Turfan. And a lot of the lines from the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo seem to be lifted directly from this text or very slightly modified. It's a longer text. It's very sort of mantra-like and kind of devotional. So it has like long sections where it's saying, I take refuge in, and then it names like 30 different bodhisattvas and Buddhas and stuff. But the very first line is Kanze on Bosatsu Namu Butsu, which is like almost the same as what we have. So we have Kanze on Namu Butsu. So this is Kanze on Bosatsu Namu Butsu. So it adds Bosatsu Bodhisattva. And then it has the line Bupboso in rather than Bupboso en. And then it also, I forgot to talk about this line, Jo Raku Ga Jo. I skipped that. I won't write it on the board because I'm so slow writing, but so this is kind of one of the most, I think, interesting parts of the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo. So in Griffith Folk's translation, so this is also found in the text that I'm referring to, the High King Avalokiteshvara Sutra. So he has, Griffith Folk in his translation has Avalokiteshvara paying homage to Buddha, forged a causal connection with Buddha, karmic affinity with Buddha, karmic affinity with Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha in this case, thus attaining permanence, ease, selfhood, and purity. So this sounds quite strange, right? Why would we be achieving permanence? There's, everything's impermanence. Why permanence? Ease, selfhood. Why selfhood's not good in Buddhism? We like anatman, not atman, and purity. So these 4 characters, should seem a little bit strange, I think, to most Buddhists. And these 4 characters come directly from the Nirvana Sutra, which sort of tries to make this claim that the Buddha, in sort of Buddhahood or Nirvana, there actually is permanence. So Nirvana is a permanent state, and it is a form of like Atman or self, and it's characterized by joy and purity. So all of these things, of course, are negated normally. So they're called the 4 pitfalls, typically, in kind of traditional Buddhism. So impermanence, suffering, no self, and defilement. These are the kind of Buddhist truths that we normally hear about. So these are instead 4 pitfalls. We, grasp for permanence. And grasp for a self, right? So this text, is instead praising these things and saying this is actually what nirvana is. So we preached kind of provisionally that there was this impermanence, but really once you get to nirvana, that's where you find permanence. And we said that there was no self, but that's just in samsara. When you get to nirvana, there really is a self there. So this is a very kind of controversial teaching, and and I think for good reason. It sort of seems to violate a lot of the things that the Buddha said, and the Nirvana Sutra, being a Mahayana sutra, is later, and so this kind of represents later sort of reinterpretation. I mean, you can argue that maybe this is sort of another way of saying the same sort of thing about nirvana, but it sort of sounds problematic, at least. So at any rate, we have that in the text too. So this direct quotation from the Nirvana Sutra, probably via this other text, the High King Avalokiteshvara Sutra. So sorry, I forgot to talk about that. So, and then very near the end of this High King Avalokiteshvara Sutra, it has Nennen Shin Fuzetsu, So the same nen, like moment by moment. Shin is mind, fu is not, and zetsu is like cut off. So it's kind of similar to this line, not separate from mind. But here it's, not cutting off mind not cut off. So at any rate, there are a lot of similarities, and there's definitely a relationship between these two texts. Can't say for sure that one didn't come before the other, but it seems likely that the High King Avalokiteshvara Sutra was produced first, probably as a kind of like condensed, condensing parts of the Nirvana Sutra and the Lotus Sutra into like one devotional text. And then the Enmei, Jukku, Kannongyo came as sort of a further condensation of that text. And at the very end of the High King Avalokiteshvara Sutra, it says, recite this 1,000 times and all serious sins are eradicated. So that's probably where we get that idea. You might be wondering, what does the Kannon chapter of the Lotus Sutra say? So it's actually kind of similar. And also the thing about the swords comes from here. So there are long lists of all the things that, having mindfulness of Avalokiteshvara will do for you. So for example, by virtue of constant mindfulness of sound observer, so that's how they're translating Kannon or Avalokiteshvara, he could not harm a single hair on one's head, or might be surrounded by enemies, each carrying a knife and intending to inflict harm. By virtue of one's constant mindfulness of sound observer, all would straightaway produce thoughts of goodwill. Or one might encounter royally ordained woes facing execution and the imminent end of one's life. By virtue of one's constant mindfulness of sound observer, the knives would thereupon break in pieces. So this is from the Lotus Sutra. It sounds very similar to what Hakuin was saying. So he might have just been conflating the actual Lotus Sutra with the Enmei, Jukku, Kannongyo when he told his story. So basically, the gist of this text is, if you have devotion to Avalokiteshvara, then Avalokiteshvara will kind of save you from all kinds of various difficult situations. Uchiyama Roshi and Sawaki Roshi have both commented on this text, but they're not available in English, unfortunately. I think Howard Lazarani, who's a friend of Sanshinji, has been working on translating Uchiyama Roshi's commentary, but I guess it's not done yet. And just the last thing that I'll talk about today is, so where does Dogen kind of stand in all of this? So it seems that since in Japan our kind of first records of the Enmei, Jukku, Kannongyo come from Hakuin, or around that time, like the Edo period, Dogen probably didn't know about it. But Dogen did write about Avalokiteshvara. And there is a chapter of the Shobogenzo called Kannon. And this was, I have my notes from it. This was the first Genzo that I ever attended, the first time I ever came to Sanshinji, the first time I ever met Hojo-san. So it was in 2013. So that was a special kind of event for me. And this text doesn't really say much at all about the actual Lotus Sutra, and of course not about the Enmei, Jukku, Kannongyo. Instead, it's mostly a commentary on a particular sort of koan story involving two Zen masters, Ungan and Dogo, they're called in Japanese, or Daowu and Yunyan. So I'll just read kind of the first few lines of this Shobogenzo Kannon. So Great Master Yunyan Wuzu, or Ungan Muju, asked Great Master Daowu Shuyi, what does the Great Compassion Bodhisattva do with innumerable hands and eyes? So Great Compassion Bodhisattva, of course, is just another way of saying Avalokiteshvara. This Great Compassion is Daihi, from the Daihi Shin Dharani. So often Avalokiteshvara is depicted with, thousands of arms and eyes. So innumerable hands and eyes. So Daowu said, the Bodhisattva is like a person who is reaching his hand behind, groping for the pillow in the night. Yeah, Misaki has a nice illustration of this too. You should check out her Instagram account of the person reaching for the pillow. Yunyan said, I understand. Daowu said, how do you understand? Yunyan said, throughout the whole body, there are hands and eyes. Daowu said, you spoke quite well, but only 80 or 90% was achieved. Yunyan said, "I am just like this. What about you, Dharma brother?" Daowu said, "The entire body is hands and eyes." So this is Hojo-san's translation. And then Dogen continues here. I'll come back to this. But as for expressing Avalokiteshvara, although we now and then hear many voices uttered both before and after Yunyan and Daowu, none of them is equal to Yunyan and Daowu. So he's saying this is the best expression that we have basically about Kannon. If we wish to study Avalokiteshvara, we need to thoroughly investigate these sayings of Yunyan and Daowu. The great compassion bodhisattva discussed here refers to the seeing the world sounds bodhisattva, that is Kanzeon Bosatsu, also called the freely seeing bodhisattva, that is Kanjizai Bosatsu. We study that this bodhisattva is the father and mother of all Buddhas. So the father and mother of all Buddhas. We might think that, because Avalokiteshvara is a bodhisattva, that, she's somehow inferior to the Buddha, but here Dogen is saying that Avalokiteshvara is the mother and father of all Buddhas. We should not study that this bodhisattva is inferior to all Buddhas and has not yet attained the way, because there's the idea, of course, that a bodhisattva delays attaining the way until they've helped all other beings. So Dogen is saying we shouldn't think that Avalokiteshvara has not attained the way. In the past, this bodhisattva was the true Dharma brightness Tathagata, that is Shobo Myorai. So he's saying that in a previous life, Avalokiteshvara was actually a Buddha and decided to sort of come back to the world to help people. So Dogen has high praise for Avalokiteshvara, and especially for this particular expression about Avalokiteshvara. So the idea here, this reaching the hand behind, groping for the pillow in the night, this gets at the idea. So in Buddhism, in East Asian Buddhism, darkness or night is often used for kind of the absolute or emptiness. So we can't differentiate anything. There's no kind of subject and object when it's totally dark. Everything's just covered by darkness. And yet there's still form there. We're still reaching for this pillow, even though we're not kind of fully conscious. So we're interacting in the world of the conventional with this sort of framing of the world of the ultimate. And then, the rest of this line, it says, throughout the whole body there are hands and eyes, and then the entire body is hands and eyes. So I think, I didn't completely restudy this, and you'd have to listen to Hojo-san's recordings to get a better take on, what this means. But, I think that the idea here, right, is that, the hands and eyes of Avalokiteshvara are sort of the means by which Avalokiteshvara is supposed to spread compassion in the world. And in some sense, compassion is simply seeing emptiness. Once we see emptiness, all suffering disappears, right? So in some sense, it's kind of the ultimate form of compassion. And so the entire body being hands and eyes, being sort of compassion, I think is what it is meant here. So in emptiness, this kind of compassion is fully realized, or another way, a more practical way maybe is, when we see emptiness, we're able to truly treat all beings, with equality and compassion. So I think that that's kind of the gist of this passage. And then finally, I think I forgot to bring it, but in Dogen's extensive record, there's also a really brief poem. So when Dogen is in China, he goes to this island, I can't remember the name of it, where Avalokiteshvara is supposed to reside. There's like a cave, and it's supposed to be like Avalokiteshvara's island or something. And so Dogen visits there, and he writes this poem that basically says that the Avalokiteshvara is found in our hearing, studying, practicing, and attaining the Dharma. It's not residing in this cave. And these pilgrims should know that if they really want to experience Avalokiteshvara, they need to practice essentially, and not, look for some actual person named Avalokiteshvara somewhere. So clearly, Dogen's interpretation of Avalokiteshvara goes way beyond some individual actor. Yeah, in conclusion, I think that this text is. Oh, and I should also say, when we do the service, we chant it 3 times, and then we have an echo afterwards, so a dedication. And we say, having chanted the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo, we offer the merit for the safe passage of those whose lives have been taken by the pandemic, for those who are ill, for everyone who provides care and comfort during this time of suffering, and for the peace and well-being of all those affected by these events. May we all find solace and strength in Buddha's way. So in some sense, we're kind of continuing this long tradition that this text is supposed to have kind of healing powers, right? So clearly Hakuin and the Lotus Sutra itself and the Chinese text are all referring to this text as having these special qualities that can save us from difficulty. Nowadays, of course, I think that most people would probably not say that this will actually have the power to do those things. By chanting this in the morning, we're probably not really saving anyone. But what I think it does do, even though you could argue that these kinds of things are sort of a holdover of superstitious practices that we're still just kind of maintaining, which I think is partially true, to be honest. But on the other hand, we, just like our tradition is adaptable and can reinterpret things to sort of meet the needs of current people. One of the things that I find that this text does, so when I'm, the doshi in the morning, and I'm sitting there in front of the altar and holding my hands in gasho as this echo is read, I feel like it really does open me up to thinking about all of the suffering, in the world related to COVID, and we have other echoes that sort of are more general for other kinds of suffering and death and so forth. And I think in our modern insulated lives, we can kind of push these things out and not really think about them. And if we do think about them, it's often like related to the self, like, oh, poor me, how am I going to avoid these things? These are all bad. But in this context, we're really thinking about, everyone else, about all beings. And I think it's a way of kind of opening up a little bit of compassion in our lives in a way that we might not otherwise. So, even though this is kind of a, devotional, maybe superstitious text, I think it still has a role to play in our lives as Buddhists. It shouldn't be, the main thing. It shouldn't replace zazen. We shouldn't, I don't think, be chanting this 1,000 times a day in lieu of doing zazen or something. But although that might be a mindful practice as well. Uchiyama Roshi apparently, I guess during the war, was forced to do various kinds of labor and stuff in support of the war effort, and apparently would chant the name of Avalokiteshvara, Namu Kanzeon Bosatsu, over and over in his head. And he sort of saw that as a replacement for zazen, because he obviously couldn't sit down and do zazen while he was being told to like move logs around or whatever. So, these practices are connected in that way, but I think especially just sort of, in the spirit of Avalokiteshvara, opening ourselves up to this broader compassion is a useful function of this text. So I'll stop there, and if anyone has any questions or comments, please go ahead.
Hey, Carla.
Is it okay? I didn't know if somebody in the room was going to say something.
Just go ahead.
Okay. All right. First of all, thank you so much for that talk. So just a few quick things. First of all, I don't know if you know this or not, but the last 4 issues of the Dharma Eye, the Soto School Journal, Hojo-san's essays about that Dogen chapter on Avalokiteshvara are in those issues. So if anybody is, interested in really delving more in that really beautiful chapter of Shobo Genzo, Hojo-san's lectures, his essays in those chapters issues are great. Doju, I want to thank you in particular for when you explained about the idea of nighttime. That was really a beautiful explanation and little teaching. So I really appreciate that. But what I want to really sort of share is, I've practiced with a Korean Seon, Zen temple for a long time, and we do a lot of chanting. There's a lot of chanting there. And I have just a notoriously bad singing voice, or just a really bad singer, And so I remember, doing it, being always really kind of self-conscious and like, but I'll say, and you kind of danced around this, like toward the end of your talk, is that chanting is a practice. Certainly in the Korean school, there, it's a practice like Zazen, and some people really specialize in that practice rather than being kind of specialists in Zazen, or seated meditation. They chant, or they do prostrations, and so I just want to say, as you had mentioned, the actual act of, just chanting is really is if you can just drop the self-consciousness, and really just put your heart in that place, it is an extremely powerful practice. And so I'm really grateful, that there are these elements of it in our school. And so I just kind of wanted to say that as kind of like a cheerleading sort of a comment, because it can be very profound and very a really powerful practice. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, of course, that's true as well. In Sotoshu, there's certainly plenty of chanting specialists, and if you, go to a training monastery, they do a lot of chanting compared to what we do. And there's also, I think it's called Komyo, which I guess means beautiful. What does it mean? Beautiful voice or something. I don't know. But at any rate, it's sort of a form of elaborate chanting, accompanied by bells and whistles, and often these, concertina texts, going up and down, because you're supposed to get the merit of the whole text, as you do that motion. Yeah, so certainly in Sotoshu, outside of North America, chanting is very important. And then I'd also say, Shinran of the Jodo Shinshu, one of the Pure Land schools in Japan. So I'd say, kind of the thing that happened during the Kamakura era was each person picked kind of one practice and made that kind of the main practice, and then said the other ones, you don't need to do those. And Dogen said basically the same thing about Zazen, right? So in Fukan, I think it's Fukan Zazengi, he says, you don't need to do chanting or nembutsu or incense offerings or prostrations. If you just do Zazen, that's enough. And Shinran was basically of the same mind, but regarding chanting the nembutsu. So he said, if he said doing Zazen is arrogant. It's like thinking that you can, you have the power to affect your own awakening, when really it has to happen through the power of Amida Butsu. And he created this dichotomy between self-power and other power. So he said that Zazen is a self-power practice, and that you're trying to use your own power to attain awakening, whereas when you chant the Nembutsu, you're relying on other power, so the power of Amida Butsu and his conception, or you could interpret it now in terms of maybe the absolute or emptiness kind of helping you through. And interestingly, in kind of modern Soto Buddhism, there was some fusion, I guess, between those two ideas. So the Sotoshu explicitly said that Zazen is an other power practice. It's not a self-power practice. Of course, this is already kind of implicit. You really have to kind of give up on the cushion to give up sort of struggling. You're not doing it, and especially if you do sesshin here, you realize this. You can't do it with your own power. You have to just kind of give up. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of crossover in these practices and how they're understood. So certainly Shinran's, what you just said about sincerely chanting and really giving up the ego and really relying on this other power rather than self-power is, what we would say is doing the same thing that we do in our Zazen. So thank you for that.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm looking at the title, added part of the title, Enmei, of the Enmei Jukku Kannongyo. The Enmei means a longing life, instead of we will die eventually, right? But we're extending life by chanting these. And with that extension of time that we get from, let's say, cheating this once, what are we supposed to do during those bonus rounds?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's an option.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that if we look at Dogen, he doesn't seem to take much stock in kind of practices that are designed to extend one's life. I think that, in kind of the broader tradition, there tends to be this dichotomy between like kind of, temple practice and lay people practice, and sort of the practices that are encouraged for lay people are ones that give you a good rebirth or extend your life, or bring this kind of samsaric happiness for a little while, so that in the next life you can really become a nun or a monk and practice in that way. So they're kind of like an expedient sort of short-term thing. But usually the kind of temple practices are, usually supposed to not be geared at extending your life, but instead, attaining awakening, which we do kind of life by life. So it doesn't really matter how long you live in a particular life. And of course, in the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, he very often sacrifices himself at a young age to, feed lions and other things like that. So I think that kind of indicates, what this kind of text is trying to do. It's one of these more devotional, maybe like lay-oriented practices. Hakuin is writing to a layperson when he writes about it. So yeah, I'd say, what do we do if we have more time? Do more practice, right? We have to practice constantly and moment by moment. So, I think that if you were to ask Dogen, he would say, what would happen if I could somehow extend my life? He would just say, keep practicing. So I guess that's the best answer I can give, given that I don't think it would actually extend your life. So.
Yeah, I like some of what you were talking about in terms of, when we do these chants during the morning service, the Daishin Jirani, during the morning services, and while we're not necessarily expecting, extending goodwill to people whose lives have been taken by the pandemic to actually cure the sick or anything like that, that it is like a helpful reflection, and it's something that sometimes we do in our own zazen. We take these vows to save all beings. Obviously, we can't save all beings, but sometimes we can save people from our own worst impulses. And when we don't know what to do in a situation, or if there's a situation beyond our control, sometimes all we can do is sit, or sometimes all we can do is really kind of sit and chant, and then maybe that can help set a little bit of that intention for the day, and depleting that your egocentric delusions just a little bit each day. Now, and this is one of the things that when I would do the Doshi in the morning, which I haven't done lately because of medication changes, has made it difficult for me to get up at 5 in the morning as much. But it's one of those things, like I'm wondering if there's helpful ways of inserting those into our regular daily practice. Because whether it's each morning, chanting the Daishin Jirani, or even just parting during meals, we take a vow, breathe in just the things that we kind of recognize at each moment. In some ways, kind of understanding the suffering that exists in the world, and to be able to kind of humble ourselves before it. But that is like a very difficult discipline to be able to maintain on such a regular basis, which I guess is why we kind of come back here every day for the support of the Sangha.
Yeah, you just need to chant it 200 to 300 So yeah, I think that what you're saying sort of reminded me that sometimes scholarly type people interpret zazen as kind of like a fake it till you make it kind of practice, that we're sort of emulating the Buddha when we do zazen. Our posture is like identical to the posture that you see on in Buddha statues, of this kind of perfect upright sitting of the Buddha, and that there's kind of this enactment that's taking place, that when we sit, we're kind of trying to enact or sort of role play the Buddha's awakening as we sit. And I think that the same can be said for the morning service. Even if it doesn't really do the things that it says it'll do, having these kind of thoughts, like wanting to cure all beings from COVID, wanting to make sure that the recently deceased attain a good rebirth, wanting to make sure that the other sick are cured, wanting to make sure that the ancestors who brought us this practice are praised and thanked for what they gave us. I think all of these things create a kind of positive mental attitude, and in the kind of Yogacara worldview, right, everything is our consciousness. So we get to choose what on some level what we have inside of our consciousness. And I think practices like this help to make that consciousness geared towards good and doing good in the world and sort of living by vow. If we just sort of let samsara do its work on us, that consciousness will not be oriented in the same kind of positive way. So I think that that's how we need to think of these practices. And if doing this at home, you don't necessarily, of course, need to come to the service to chant this and say this echo. You could do that yourself. There are other practices, that are kind of similarly oriented. There's a whole tradition of loving kindness meditation, which I think is a very kind of powerful practice where with each in breath, you're taking on the suffering of others. Each out breath, you're giving your resources to all beings. We don't need to replace our zazen with it, but I think doing these kinds of things occasionally helps to orient us in a sort of bodhisattvic orientation. So I don't know if that helps or answers your question, but yeah.
Anybody else online have any questions?
Anyone here, or should we wrap up?
Maybe a quick thing I noticed is you wrote Butsu, 2 different characters.
Oh yeah.
And I know sometimes that can have like a cognitive difference.
In this case, it's just, and this is easier to write. So in Japanese, they're simplified. Some characters are simplified from the classical Chinese. So when I was studying this, it was like the classical Chinese version of the text, but because I'm so bad at writing and slow, like the other version has more strokes and it's easier for me to mess up. So that's the original version of the character, and this is a simplified version of that. Chinese, of course, modern Chinese also has simplified characters, but they're different between Japanese and Chinese. Some of the other ones, I think, so Kan also is a simplified version, but even though the traditional one is longer, somehow it's easier for me to write. This is also simplified Sutra. The original one's like the right-hand side part. How does it look?
You need to focus more on your character development.
Yeah, I do. Anyways, so there are simplified Japanese characters, basically. All right, anything else or wrap up?
Hey, Doju, this is again, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm always interested in chanting is near and dear to my heart, having practiced with the Tibetan lineages. But again, like Jigen, it's very, for me, it was very good to hear, not trying to get attached to, pronouncing everything right, just kind of, going with the flow, and it kind of takes you out of the mind. So I really appreciated your commentary on that. So Gasho, and thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I guess just as a disclaimer, I should say that, this lineage, like, at Hojo-san on Taiji, they didn't do any chanting at all. So this is kind of like I guess an add-on a little bit, which is not to say that it's not valuable, but in our lineage, it tends to be kind of de-emphasized. But make of that what you will. All right, so should we wrap up? Anything else?
Beings are unrest. I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I
is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Meanings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.